to do this, I'm joined by the lovely Helen-Ann Smith, who is Sky's Asia correspondent. We're also joined by Tom Cheshire, your predecessor, who covered that patch for nearly
4.5 years.
4.5 years. Okay. But you're now Sky's data and forensics correspondent. Tom, can I start with you? Because you spent many years, didn't you, investigating, reporting on the Uyghur community. So who are they and what have they been through?
I mean, they've been through a tremendous amount. I mean, the Uyghurs are recognised as an ethnic minority in China. There's around 11 or 12 million in China. There's also diaspora, lots of connections with countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, but big communities in Turkey as well, Saudi Arabia, mainly Muslim group. They're in Xinjiang, which is in the far northwest of the country. They've been there for hundreds of years. Still have Uyghurs mainly in the south of the country, and still, very clear identity when you visit those parts.
Helen-Ann, you have recently been to Xinjiang, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But Tom, when COVID hit, Xinjiang was suddenly locked down, and only now we're starting to get access for Western journalists to go in there. But what did you know of the area?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge area to start with. You've got amazing mountains, things like that. It's got these flatlands, grasslands too. Then you've got big cities like Urumqi, which is its capital, which has a lot more Han Chinese, so that's the dominant ethnicity in China. But if you go close to the border, southwest Kashgar, Hotan, places like that have a lot more of a Uyghur identity. And what happened with COVID, though, I mean, this happened everywhere in China.
Yeah.
Very hard to get places because you had these health codes, but especially with Xinjiang, so it's always been a sensitive region. During that pandemic, it wasn't even a case that you might get quarantined. It's just you couldn't get a flight there because either Beijing had a case or Xinjiang had a case, and really spent a lot of time in isolation. So for a long time, we didn't really know what was going on in the ground.
Tell us, I mean, you recently got back from Xinjiang.
It's an absolutely beautiful province. I mean, I was looking out the window when our plane came into land, just the most astonishing mountain ranges, snow-capped, and then you sort of flew on a bit and it's these vast deserts. The cities are ancient, and Kashgar, for example, has this utterly stunning old town sort of built of this sort of sandstone kind of a yellow brick, if you like. And it really is kind of a beautiful place, and a place that once had a very, very strong cultural identity. And we will talk more about this, but that's a cultural identity that's sort of slowly, gradually been kind of whitewashed kind of by the Chinese government in recent years. And it's, really been a sort of a 5-6 years, very concerted campaign to sort of control and oppress them, to put it quite frankly. I mean, there was a series of terror attacks back in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, sort of perpetrated by Uyghur people who kind of felt oppressed in various ways. And then there was a number of riots where there was violence on both sides, actually, Uyghur against Han and Han against Uyghur. But as a result of that, sort of Xi Jinping's government launched what they called a strike hard campaign. That started in 2014, actually, but it really intensified in 2017. And essentially under the guise of anti-terror, the Uyghur people were essentially arrested en masse for tiny, tiny things, such as owning a book that was banned, or having a beard, having once had a foreign holiday, having a relative living abroad. These people arrested, detained, and out of these sort of camps that got set up, I mean, there's just awful, awful stories of torture, of beatings, of forced sterilization in some cases. We have stories of children being separated from their parents, put into boarding schools where they weren't allowed to speak the Uyghur language, which is a sort of Turkic language. Truly, truly atrocious crackdown. But that really culminated sort of towards the start of your tenure there, Tom. Is that right? In sort of 2018?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking like 1 million, 2 million people. It's fast. And the way it sort of starts, 2014, you have that national campaign, Strike Down. When Xi Jinping visits in 2014, one of those terror attacks happens and it intensifies, and they bring a man called Chen Tuanguo, who was running Tibet as party secretary and doing some effective repression there. Xi Jinping brings him in. He arrives in 2016. 2017 is when you start to see these camps being built, this mass internment, and everything that entails that Helen-Ann describes. And it is just a huge campaign. When you start to try and visit and understand what's going on, it was very hard to get at that story. The sort of level of obstruction by the authorities was extraordinary in terms of you arrive there and you're being followed by 8 cars. You try and go to these camps and, there'll be a road accident one day where you see a scooter very gently leaning against a car and they say, well, this whole road's shut, we can't go. It's like, okay, fine, we'll come back the next day. Sadly, there's been another accident involving a different scooter and a car, or they're fixing an electrical fault.
These re-education camps, you've spoken to people from the Uyghur community, but what they're saying, activists are saying, actually, the Uyghur sort of culture, you said it's been whitewashed, it's being threatened. What's the sense from this community about how they're being targeted, Helen?
Certainly, sort of back in the height of the crackdown, them being targeted, it was just complete. I think people felt that they could barely kind of step outside. They could certainly not go to the mosque. They couldn't openly talk in their sort of native language without feeling some sort of threat. Certainly anything as dramatic as talking to a foreign journalist, that would be a direct arrest. And there are mosques that still exist in Xinjiang, and there are cultural sites that still exist, but a lot of them, based on satellite imagery and on the ground reporting, have been destroyed, or at the very least sort of de-Islamified. So some of the kind of Islamic architecture taken away from some of these sites. In our recent trip, we saw, for instance, mosques that are now shops in kind of the old town and things like that. And it's
and sometimes in China, China's such a fast developing place. Sometimes you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. There's a lot of development that happens all around the country, especially under the guise of poverty alleviation. That's a lot of what officials would say. We went to a graveyard which had just been bulldozed, and this is lots, people buried there for decades and decades. We found a child's bone just left out there in the dirt. And that starts to feel a lot more deliberate and targeted. China will always say we protect our ethnic minorities. And every propaganda video you'll see, it'll have Uyghur people dancing or cooking food. And those are sort of the two allowed activities they do, and a sort of a model minority sort of feel to that. But that obviously doesn't encompass all of Uyghur culture. It's not just dancing the whole time.
There was one thing we saw when we were there that I was like, wow, I feel that really sort of encapsulates that sense of what Uyghur culture now looks and feels like in Xinjiang. And that was, so in Kashgar's old city, and it's very touristy, and it has been very actively designed and sort of kind of preserved in that sense. You get this in quite a few Chinese cities, actually, that are tourist hotspots. You get these shops where people can go and rent costumes to then have sort of photos taken in the kind of local costume. And you get these Han Chinese people dressing up in Uyghur costume, kind of having their photos taken. If a Uyghur person were to just walk around in their native dress, I mean, you just never saw it. And I don't know what would happen. It's probably pretty likely that they would have gotten arrested, certainly back in 2017 for that. We went to Kashgar's main mosque and hung out there for an hour or so just to kind of watch people coming and going. We didn't see one person who we believed to be a worshipper going into that mosque. We saw groups and groups of tourists going into the mosque. And yes, we might have missed one person here or there who looked like a tourist and was perhaps a worshipper, but it really didn't feel that way. And I think that was pretty telling.
What are the allegations then? Let's just set this out. The allegations against China for whitewashing the Uyghur community, what are those?
Yeah, I mean, especially starting in 2017, this mass internment of anywhere between 1 and 2 million Uyghurs. We don't know how many, just because there were so many, but China hasn't been frank with those figures, really. Vocational training, they've never said how many people graduated properly. They've given some figures, but they're incomplete. We went to a different part near Qingdao in the east, where we're pretty sure they were using forced Uyghur labor in seafood processing, for instance. So Uyghur workers exported around the country without any freedom of movement, had to be signed off by a party official. They're kept in dormitories, kept a very close eye on. And then beyond that, the sort of the cultural side of things, as Helen-Ann's talking about, those signs of identity being clamped down on, only the very prescribed, this is what you can do according to the Chinese Communist Party. Uyghurs abroad being separated from their children. We spoke to people in Turkey who hadn't seen their children for a very long time until they saw it on Douyin, which is the Chinese TikTok of the kids saying, I love China, China is my flag. It was his child. He hadn't seen for 5 days. He's speaking Mandarin rather than speaking Uyghur. And these boarding schools, we went to visit them as well. These are happening in all sorts of places. And then also the transnational repressions. When we were sort of starting reporting the story, it was very tricky to get people to speak because they were scared about their families.
It still is. It's still so hard.
Really, really tricky because there's so much at stake for them. They get Chinese spies trying to convince them to spy on the Uyghur community. There's a lot of intimidation and pressure that goes on Uyghurs abroad.
Helen, on your recent trip to Xinjiang, what did you notice? Did you get close to the camps?
Yeah, so we did. There has been a change, and there has been a step change. And I think that's part of the reason we wanted to go on the most recent trip we did, to sort of figure out in that time during zero COVID, where people haven't really been able to get in and out, how's that policy moved on? What does it look like? It's also really important to say that China faced a lot of international condemnation for this, and a lot of embarrassment, actually. And I think China, to a degree, didn't quite anticipate the world comparing what was going on in Xinjiang to Nazi concentration camps. It was embarrassing.
People like, Tony Blair in 2014 gives an interview to the Global Times where he says, China and the UK and Russia, we all have a common cause, which is Islamic terrorism and combating that. China's always referred to the Prevent program as a model of that. Yeah, we're just doing something like that.
Yeah, quite. And then when it sort of transpired that what was going on in Xinjiang was clearly something of an entirely different league, China suffered not just reputational damage, but major economic damage as well. There's a law in America, for example, where no product that has any connection whatsoever to Xinjiang can be sold. So I think there was a sense from China that the policy needed to develop, right? In the time that it's been sort of semi-closed really because of COVID, there were rumours that had come out that things had taken a step down, that the mass arrests had stopped, that some Uyghurs were being released from these detention camps. And it's been very difficult to assess whether that's true. So what our sort of aim was when we went was to try and figure that out. So we broadly tried to go and visit as many places that we were aware of that were former re-education camps or detention centres or prisons of some description, and to try and assess what those places were now being used for. Of the kind of what you would call the lower security sites that we visited, the ones that were being used for re-education, so the ones where people were kind of being put in sort of mock classrooms, taught Chinese, the ones that the Chinese described as vocational, were largely not being used for that purpose anymore. So we visited 14 such sites, and of those, 8 were very visibly schools. Now, what type of school? A little bit difficult to verify. 2 were completely abandoned, sort of dusty windows. You could peer through the cracks and see these kind of strange old playgrounds with sort of kind of rubbish blowing through them. There was only 1 that we went to that we felt probably was potentially still being used as some form of vocational school, as the Chinese like to call it. There was a banner across sort of describing it as a vocational school. It was set right next to a prison. It was relatively heavily securitized. Again, difficult to say for 100% certain, but that's how we felt. But what is really interesting about that, so, over 90% of the re-education sites we visited were clearly no longer being used for that purpose. And China said back in 2019 that everybody who was involved in vocational re-education has now graduated. So that's what China wanted us to see. That's the message, right? That it's over, people have been re-educated, they have been released. However, the statistics, the survivor testimony all point towards the fact that although some of these re-education centres might be closed, the people who were locked up in them are not necessarily free. We know that from family members that we have spoken to who say, my brother was held in that abandoned camp that you visited. He might not be there anymore, but we know he's not free. He was given a 14-year prison sentence, for instance. There was an enormous spike in arrests in 2017, 2018, but there was also this huge jump in 2017 of the proportion of people given a very lengthy sentence. So the proportion of people given a sentence longer than 5 years jumped from sort of 11% to 87%. So just statistically, those people are still going to be locked up somewhere. And the prisons absolutely in every single case were absolutely operational, right? Fearsome, intimidating places, really watchtowers, high walls, barbed wire fences. And of course, as journalists as well, you always know you're being sort of watched and followed, and it was sort of nerve-wracking filming around them. It felt tense. I think what we're seeing now compared to what Tom and team saw back a few years ago is almost sort of a formalization of this internment, a legitimization. They're now kind of putting these people into the justice system. And yes, okay, it might not be justice as we would understand it, but it's almost trying to make the process slightly more invisible, slightly more acceptable to the world. But these people are not free, and they're still interned on very, very weak charges.
I think when they come up with the idea of vocational training centres, re-education camps, it's not a bizarre idea in China. It's had a long history of this.
Correct.
It's part of the culture in a way. And so when it sees that backlash, it's sort of, okay, let's formalise this, let's put it in a more Western-friendly way, when perhaps if they'd done that from the start, it would have been different. Like you say, trying to make it more acceptable to the world, even though it is not acceptable.
I want to talk about the shrine that you both attempted visits to in a second, but the response from the government in China. We've touched on it a little bit, but what are they saying? They're trying to reintroduce these prisons and maybe de-escalate the education camps, as they call it.
There's 2 things we should discuss here, actually. I think it's what they say and also how they behaved in terms of how they treated us as a team versus how they treated Tom as a team. Of course, when you do these stories, you always, as a journalist, put in the right of reply to kind of the party that you are sort of suggesting might have fallen foul of certain standards of behaviour. And for years, China, you guys would put those right of responses in and China would never respond. We actually got a response, which...
So they want to get a message out to the world via Western journalists.
Absolutely. There is a sense that they are engaging in a way that they hadn't before. Some of this response we've heard before. I mean, they said the allegations of so-called camps are sheer lies. The vocational education and training centres were set up in accordance to the law. So remember, they always talk about it as being a school, vocational. They said that everyone who was involved is now graduated. They say that everyone is leading normal lives, that they're not subject to any sort of special preconditions. But there's just one bit, and you can sort of read between the lines here kind of as much as you like. They sort of said in their statement, through education and training, the trainees' overall capability as well as their awareness of the nation's citizenship and rule of law was significantly enhanced. They also came to see the harmful nature of terrorism and extremism and broke free from the sway of terror and extremist ideas. So they're not denying that these schools exist for the purpose of re-educating people. And that kind of subtle nuance there that you can read, that we have taught these people the right way. It speaks through, right? And of course, we looking in from the outside, and certainly the Uyghur people would probably feel that, their way of thinking wasn't terrorist or extremist, but that is absolutely how the Chinese see it.
There was a terrorism problem. Whether 1 million, 2 million people are all terrorists, they need to be locked up for having a beer, for things we've talked about. The proportion of the response there, that sort of speaks to that. It's like we've re-educated all these people who might have extremist thought. 2 million people having extremist thoughts.
Yeah.
Seems unlikely.
We get followed and surveilled in almost every story that we do in China. So we were expecting high levels of surveillance and intimidation and harassment in Xinjiang, because that's what teams have experienced in the past, and it's not that uncommon in China. But even in Xinjiang, the most sensitive of provinces, we were really surprised how much license we were given.
It's interesting, isn't it? That change of direction when you both went to visit a cultural site, a shrine. You both had different experiences. So, Tom, what happened to you?
Yeah, so we wanted to go and visit the Imam Azim shrine near Hotan, and it's a bit further out of the city. Very similar experience, blocked roads to start with. So you drive a bit further on, and it's across these sort of sand dunes. So Mark, hopefully the cameraman, and I sort of hop out, get ready for a walk, and it's quite a long walk over, probably about a couple of miles through like pretty effective desert.
Yeah.
And then as we're sort of getting a bit closer, we see on the horizon there's a few figures who are starting to follow us, pick up the pace. But they head us off, and there's about a group of 8 men, quite big lads. And they're goons basically. They're there to sort of enforce it. We try and go on, they push us back, trying to grab the camera again. There's quite a lot of them, and so we give up at that point, and we never see the shrine. That was 2019?
2019,
okay.
Yeah. So we went, obviously, a few weeks ago, 2023. Completely different experience. We drove out. We were kind of expecting roadblocks. They didn't come. We knew we were being followed at that time, but nobody stopped us. We drove all the way down, almost about 100 meters away from where the shrine was. And then there was one guy on you see them a lot in China, is a little sort of almost like a motorized farm vehicle, I'd call it. One guy, and he was Uyghur in appearance, speaking Uyghur actually. And he was like saying, no, you can't. We walked around him. There was no big problem. We walked up to the shrine. This place is one of the holiest places for the Uyghur people. It was a place of pilgrimage. It's a place that apparently at all times of year there would be people there, but particularly when we were there in May, apparently that's normally festival time. So there would be, many hundreds of people there. There used to be a big bazaar that was held next to it, almost like a fun fair sort of vibe that families would come and spend time. There was apparently a mosque complex at one point. And then people would come and they'd bring these flags up and sort of pin them in the shrine and perform their acts of worship. And we arrived there, as I said, with this one man who was vaguely trying to stop us, but not particularly concertedly. And it was just silent. I mean, the bazaar area had all gone. All the infrastructure around had gone. The shrine itself was still there, of course, without all the flags that people put in. But it was eerie, desolate. It was silent. I found it quite sad, actually.
So what do you think this means then for the Uyghur community? And then also, what does this change in policy say for China's attitudes towards the Uyghur community? Because what next?
I find it very hard to see how in any sort of immediate years things go back to what they were, right? People are terrified there. You can't speak to people there, even outside China. I mean, I did an interview with a survivor outside China who actually left Xinjiang in relatively recent times, so saw kind of some of this change of policy. She was absolutely terrified. They just simply do not feel that they can go to the mosque. They simply do not feel that they can teach Uyghur to their children. They simply do not feel that they can live their kind of cultural identity in the way that they probably would want to, and that will be lasting.
Yeah, it's hard to see how it gets worse, really. I mean, they've been through a horrible bat, but as we know, so many people are still in prison, culture eroded, hollowed out. It's a horrible place. But, you go to anywhere in Xinjiang and all the butcher's knives are chained to the table. It's sort of that level of securitization that people have to deal with on a daily basis. I think maybe the thing that is heartening for the Uyghur community is the attention it has got abroad, especially in terms of sanctions. So Helen-Ann mentioned the forced labor and how that's banned in the US. That's had a really big impact on it. You see them trying to do this, show everyone that the re-education is over, and they're hoping the world will forget. And I think what the Uyghur community want, especially the expat Uyghur community, is still to have that attention, still to have journalists like Helen-Ann going there, showing the world what it's like.
Day-to-day life for people in Xinjiang, I think probably has improved a bit, actually, because actually just the day-to-day high level of securitization in Xinjiang has taken a step down. So there was a time where even to go into any larger shop or restaurant or hotel, you'd have to have a full kind of metal ID scan, like sort of airport style. You were, road stops, police checks on every road. You don't have to have the full body scans. No. And there's been a real notable dialing down of some of that stuff. And I think, again, that's probably a purposeful decision, because I think it's not just the Uyghur people, but also the Han people who live in Xinjiang. I mean, it must have been exhausting to live like that. But perhaps it also speaks to a confidence of the authorities. And I think that I really felt that in the air when we were there. They have done enough over the past however many years to make people feel too scared to put a foot out of line. And so they know they can sort of withdraw some of that security apparatus.
And that people will toe the line.
Xi Jinping always said
that was the aim. That was the aim.
Entirely correct.
Yeah.
This huge repression, entirely correct. It's achieved its goals.
So there is a sense of mission complete. How that then plays out over future years, if there is some sort of resurgence of that sort of Uyghur identity, and how that plays out and how the Chinese government respond, who knows? Yes, this policy is in a new phase, but goodness, what those people have been through and experienced is horrendous.
And that's exactly true. But it's worth bearing in mind what the direction of travel in China generally. The Uyghur people have borne the brunt of that, absolutely. Really been targeted, singled out, treated appallingly. But the direction of travel of China under Xi Jinping ever since he took power has been more control by the authorities over every aspect of life. Yeah. And that extends across society, whether it's in business and tech. COVID was a very, real articulation of that. It was very visible, especially for people in Shanghai who had suddenly locked down. They looked at this and thought, well, Xinjiang, Uyghurs, that's a long way away. They're troublemakers, they're terrorists. Then it happens to them. People have been reminded all through Chinese society of the primacy of the party headed by Xi Jinping.
Guys, it's so fascinating. It's wonderful to have you both together here on this podcast. My thanks to Helen-Ann Smith and Tom Cheshire. You can check out your reports on the Sky News YouTube page. Just type in Uyghur. That's where lots of your reports are too, Tom. So thank you so much for joining us here today on the podcast.
It was produced
by Annie Joyce, and the podcast editor is Paul Stanworth.